It is a real shame that the work of our today's protagonist is overshadowed by the controversial nature of his dramatic end. In broad daylight and in front of dozens of eyewitnesses, Mehdi Ben Barka was abducted in front of the Brasserie Libre in Paris on the 29th October 1965 and has been considered disappeared ever since. Ben Barka, an exiled Moroccan, wanted to meet a director here to make a film on the theme of anti-colonialism. He never showed up for the meeting, and all the questions about his whereabouts, or rather his remains, and especially those about the culprits, remain unanswered. Even after 58 years, there's hardly any clarity in the Ben Barka case. How can that be, you ask? It's simple. Mehdi Ben Barka made so many powerful enemies with his vision of the three continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America and their unification that it could have been anyone. De Gaulle's France and Hassan II's Morocco are at the top of the list of perpetrators. But there's also talk of CIA and Mossad involvement. People are blaming each other, and the only thing that is certain is that no one here is telling the truth. Mehdi Ben Barka is considered one of the most important revolutionary theoreticians along with Frantz Fanon and Che Guevara. But unlike Che, Ben Barka does not adorn the wall of a 14-year-old wannabe revolutionary in poster form today. Actually, that's too bad, because the mathematical genius Ben Barka would be an amazing role model. Born in Rabat in 1920 as the third child of a housewife and a secretary, Mehdi Ben Barka grew up in the modest circumstances of an ordinary middle-class family. Morocco is a divided country at this time. Since 1912, the country has officially been under French protective rule. Morocco was characterized by more than 1,000 years of independence, so subjugating the Moroccans was more difficult for the French, who actually wanted to proceed here in the same way as in Tunisia and in Algeria. In Algeria, for example, the nobility and ruling class were completely abolished, while in Morocco they wanted to leave the upper class in place and let them enforce French influence in Morocco as their puppet. The Sultan's power was kept low, and the real power lay primarily with the French administration. Just how much power the French had and how little they liked independence efforts was shown by their suppression of the Berber uprising in the Rif War. Young Mehdi thus grows up in an unfree Morocco, occupied by the French colonial power, which wants to strip the country of its resources. But Mehdi is not yet interested in this injustice. Rather, it becomes clear early on what kind of thirst for knowledge he has. He soon gets bored at the Koran school and sets his mind on going to one of the better French schools. However, this is a privilege and only allowed to French people or the Moroccan bourgeoisie. In other words, children from families that have fully submitted to the French colonial power. Mehdi does not care about this artificial barrier, which is meant to dissuade him from his will. And so young Mehdi camps outside the school for months, until 4 months later, a professor decides to take the boy under his wing and enroll him at the school. Mehdi quickly outperforms here the other students as well. We can already see here the potential Mehdi has. When he is 10 years old, there's an uproar in the country. The French issue the so-called Berber d'Ahir, a decree intended to further divide the country and make it easier to subjugate. A wedge is to be driven between the Arabs and the Berbers in the country, whereby from now on, depending on the origin, people should have different rights. France's goal is to favor the Berbers in order to weaken the unifying effect of Islam. According to Louis Massignon, the aim was to eliminate the Arabic language and Islam in our North Africa in favor of the French language and Christianity. But the Americans are fighting back. More and more desire independence and autonomy. This rising nationalism now shapes the young Mehdi. Until 1934, he devotes himself solely to school, but he becomes more and more interested in the idea of a free Morocco. His role model here is, among others, Atatürk, who successfully defended the sovereignty of Turkey. At only 14, Mehdi is one of the founding members of the first political movement in Morocco, and at 17 he is the youngest member of the Independence Party, which would later become known as the Istiklal Party. Along the way, Mehdi graduates with a baccalaureate in mathematics, becoming the first Moroccan in history to graduate summa cum laude. From then on, France also courted the child prodigy, who wanted to put his skills at the service of the colonial apparatus. But Ben Barka's goal is quite clear: Moroccan independence. He studied mathematics in Algeria and broadened his horizons. He realizes that not only Morocco, but the entire Maghreb must be independent. Back in Morocco, Ben Barka starts working as a professor of mathematics at the Royal Academy at the age of only 23. One of his students is none other than his later adversary, the future king of Morocco, Hassan II. Sultan Mohammed V, Hassan II's father, is tired of his role as a prisoner of the colonial administration and wants an independent Morocco, free from the French. During the Second World War, he protected Moroccan Jews from deportation and showed his distaste for Nazi Germany, earning from Franklin D. Roosevelt the promise to support Moroccan independence after the war. And so, in 1944, Mohammed V signed a proclamation of independence independence of Morocco without having previously discussed it with the French administration. Mehdi Ben Barka's signature can also be found on the proclamation. At the age of 24, he is the youngest signatory. As might be expected, France is not amused by this. All the signatories were imprisoned, and Ben Barka was also sent to prison for more than a year. But he did not allow himself to be silenced. He continues to campaign so strongly for the independence of his country that French General Alphonse Juin calls him enemy number one of France and Morocco. France continues to try to neutralize him, and in 1951 he is exiled domestically to the southern Atlas Mountains for a full 3 years. But even here he does not let himself be broken. He learns Berber and also English to write reports about the Moroccan situation to the United Nations. The Sultan Mohammed V was also exiled because he continued to support the national movements in the country and was not fit to be a puppet ruler. It became increasingly restless in the country, and the people would not let themselves be brought down. Since France was now fully involved in the War of Independence in the neighboring Algeria, and could not afford a second war in North Africa, the colonial power had no choice but to bring Mohammed V back from exile in Madagascar and enthrone him again in 1955. Mehdi Ben Barka played a decisive role in the negotiations for the Sultan's return. France had to withdraw from Morocco a few months later and released the country into independence. Unlike other countries that gained their independence, the Independence Party here in Morocco did not take the power. Instead, the Sultan Mohammed V set out to establish a constitutional monarchy, for which he wanted to build a modern government, and appointed himself king in 1957. Mehdi Ben Barka worked closely with Mohammed V as the president of parliament. He wanted to dismantle the old colonial structures, both in the state apparatus and in the minds of the people, and wants to organize democratic structures. To this aim, he travels around the country, gives seminars, and speaks to the people about topics related to education, women's policy, and the strengthening of rural areas. Having just become one of the heroes of independence, Ben Barka's socialist ideas increasingly came into conflict with his own party, the wealthy minority in the country, and the king's son and former student Hassan II. In 1959, Ben Barka split from the Istiklal party, which was not proactive enough for him. His new Union Nationale des Forces Populaires advocated socialist policies and wanted to finally break French influence in the country, which still existed despite formal independence. Hassan II is far less open to power sharing or a more equitable distribution of property than his father Mohammed V, who wanted to act as a conciliator of powers. As commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Hassan II often carried out the law to his will. For example, he had 2 chief editors arrested for writing that the government was beholden to the people rather than the king. His tendency for violence and cruelty was also evident in the brutal suppression of rebellious Berber tribes during the Rif Wars in the late 1950s. Hassan II's goal was already clearly evident here: the dissolution of the government and the restoration of absolute power to the monarch. And for this he also put pressure on his father. Mohammed V tried to be the balancing force between the powers, but he died as early as 1961 at the age of only 52 during what was actually a harmless operation. It is said that he wanted to prevent his son Hassan II from taking power and wanted to cancel his nomination as crown prince, because he also disliked the way his son treated the people. In Morocco, the so-called years of elite now follow. 3 decades in which Hassan II terrified his own people with oppression and violence. Ben Barka has now been in exile in Paris for 2 years, but he is still fighting the Moroccan state power, only from a distance. But he is now concerned not only with an end to colonial influence in Morocco and the monarchy, but in all exploited countries suffering under imperialism and neocolonialism. When he returned to Morocco in 1962, he publicly criticized in Casablanca Hassan II's rule, the board elites, the repressive state organs, and the entire neocolonial system. For Ben Barka, the king is just a docile instrument of neocolonialism. As was almost to be expected, he then becomes the target of several assassination attempts. Sometimes he is shot at, sometimes they try to divert his car on the road. Each time he narrowly escapes with his life. In 1963, the elections take place. Despite election manipulation, Ben Barka's party and the Istiklal win the majority. Now everything can be good again, right? Unfortunately, it is not that simple. Hassan II opened the hunt for the party members in 1964. The reason? They are allegedly planning a plot to overthrow the king. Those who are caught are tortured and imprisoned. Ben Barka, who is in Cairo at the time, learns from afar about the cruelty inflicted on his fellow party members and is also sentenced to death in absentia. He decides to remain in exile and should never return to Morocco. In fact, this is not Ben Barka's first death sentence. Already the year before, during his stay in Algiers, he condemns the sand war that has just broken out between Algeria and Morocco, a banal war for territory and resources. Ben Barka publicly calls on Moroccan soldiers to lay down their arms. This war is just another outgrowth of the damned neocolonialism that is spreading more and more in the south. For even after independence, the colonialists never really left their colonies. Ben Barka has thus identified the real enemy, the former colonial states, but also the United States, as the largest imperial power. Of course, this is no small opponent. He has to find allies for the real fight, the final boss, so to speak. Neocolonialism. Ben Barka knows that the exploited countries are only strong when united, and so he meets with like-minded people in Algiers, including Amilcar Cabral, Malcolm X, and Che Guevara. In Algiers, the revolutionary Ahmed Ben Bella planned a solidarity conference that would bring together the countries of Africa and Asia that were suffering from the dominance of the West. This never happened, as the building where the meeting was to take place was bombed, and Ben Bella was overthrown. Mehdi Ben Barka now took over the leadership. He organized the first Tricontinental Conference in 1966 in association of the non-aligned countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The desire was to create a strong counterweight to neo-imperialism that would finally eliminate the inequality in the world. You can guess who is not interested in the freedom of the states of the South and a fair distribution of interests and power, and what these forces are willing to do to prevent it. The following items were on the agenda of the Tricontinentalists, bearing Ben Barka's signature: support for national liberation movements, especially the Palestinian movement, intensification of struggles including armed ones on 3 continents, support for Cuba, liquidation of foreign military bases, opposition to nuclear weapons, apartheid, and racial segregation. Ben Barka's concepts are borrowed from Marxist analysis. The scale of his thinking is global, and the basis of his resistance is tricontinental. It is by understanding that real independence is impossible without an international expansion of the solidarity of the dominated that Ben Barka realizes the importance of building a tricontinental front. Ben Barka, the mastermind and organizer behind the Tricontinental Conference, will not be able to attend himself. About 2 months before the conference, on October 29, 1965, Ben Barka planned to meet with the director in Paris at the Brasserie Lippe to discuss the film project Basta, an anti-colonial film to be shown at the Tricontinental. Ben Barka is approached by 2 French police officers on his way to the meeting point in broad daylight on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. They ask him to get into the car, which he does voluntarily. He was never to be seen again. There are hundreds of theories surrounding his death, the whereabouts of his remains, and especially about the killers. I won't go into all of them here. A man who demanded so much change in the world, challenged the system at the very top, also had enemies at the very top. It is precisely because he was a figure of this international front, because he actively militated for the definitive liberation of the peoples of the South, that he became an international enemy for the powerful of this world. There is no doubt that it is in this revolutionary momentum of the Tricontinental that lies the cause of the kidnapping and assassination of Ben Barka. Mehdi Ben Barka was an extraordinary bright mind with a clear vision of a fairer world. He is one of the great fighters for the rights of the dispossessed, like Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, Amilcar Cabral, and Thomas Sankara, and unfortunately he has not only the revolutionary ideas in common with them, but also the unnatural, violent, and much too early end. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are interested in other extraordinary personalities of history, please click here.